a statement that you dislike certain people. Let's say I hate migrants, for example, a claim about your subjective state, or an evaluative claim like migrants are very bad, or a claim like, well, and here's a slurring claim, you know, you are migrant vermin or something like that. What's the difference? What's going on here? There's a difference in the speech act structure, and that's why they have different effects. That's why slurring has a specific kind of, call it, sting to it. Where does that come from? So that's my concern. So at this point, you could put forward various theories about what the speech act structure or the content is in general of, let's say, slur claims or slur sentences, even when they're not asserted or independently produced. They might be embedded, for example. So here are some various options. You might go for some sort of representational realism. You think that there really is a property of Z-ness, where Z is the slur term. Or you might think it resides in a kind of mode of thinking about a certain class of things. You might think it's subjectivism. I dislike Fs, or of a certain group, etc. You might think it's what I call assertorically evaluative, that you are asserting, let's say, that a certain group or person is bad. I'm unhappy with all of these answers. I'm unhappy with, although I'm a card-carrying expressivist, I'm not happy with a crude expressivism, according to which when you issue a slur claim, you're sort of booing certain classes of people. I don't think that can be right for various reasons. I'm not going to go into the reasons here. A hybrid crude expressivism might work, you might think, where you are making a claim that a certain person belongs to a certain group, and you're also booing the person. I don't like that either. Here's some stuff or a position which seems to be interesting, and it brings in Lewisian language game understanding in terms of scorekeeping. So Mary Kate McGowan has developed these ideas. So she takes, take productions of sexist and oppressive speech. What's going on? Well, the production of such speech acts brings about a sort of conversational score shift or updating. And that's where the operation of the oppression or the slurring is going to happen. So in that sense, she thinks that these speech acts, where you say things like whatever, something slurry or some piece of oppressive speech act production, that they're like, these speech acts are like exercitives. They bring about normative statuses, and these statuses can be oppressive. This is interesting stuff, but for me, it doesn't really, or the part I worry about, is that it doesn't really explain the difference between speech acts like, sorry, I'm going to say this, it's an example from her paper, the paper I'm thinking about from the AJP, I banged the bitch, as opposed to I had sex with her, women are worthy of contempt. There seems to be something very different going on in the speech act structure between 1 and 2. Both would involve, let's say, updating. If you were to produce such speech acts, they would involve a change in, it seems, a conversational score about what's been, the information current in the conversation, etc. But updating per se doesn't explain kind of difference in the nature of the effect between 1 and 2. Now, as I recall, if you look at Lewis's discussion in his paper, he brings in the notion of accommodation. And I think McGowan is sort of invoking this. And accommodation means information state change when audiences are informed by presuppositions. In other words, someone may say something involving a presupposition, And I may be, as it were, informed by that presupposition, or may not have sort of thought about it, but I take it on. I kind of assimilate it, and that's called accommodation. But Lewis doesn't, as far as I can see, really explain what accommodation is. As opposed, so in other words, accommodation presupposes the idea of presupposition. So until we're clear about the distinction between presupposing something, or let's say asserting something, we don't quite know what the power or the nature of accommodation is. In fact, that point's been made by, I think, Christopher Gauker in a few of his papers. Sorry, I don't have the references, but I'm just drawing on that kind of critique. So the question is then, well, at this point we might say, well, then tell us what presupposition is. So that's kind of one of my main concerns. There's presupposition, but of course, to understand presupposition, we're going to have to understand saying. So there's saying on one side, and there's sort of presupposing, or the unsaid on the other side. So there are basically two kinds of presupposition. There's truth conditional presupposition, that is presupposition that has impact on truth value. And you can find that in things like, it was the butler who did it, for example. And then there's conventional implicature, which you find with terms like but, even, etc. And this is non-truth conditional. It's failure of the presuppositions that you get with but and even don't generate truth value gaps or truth value failure. So things like even Granny was dancing, or here's poor but nice. The presuppositional content here, it runs in parallel to what's said. It's not interacting with it in the way that it does with truth conditional presupposition. So what's common to both kinds of presuppositions is this idea of the not said, the taken for granted, the not at issue. But what exactly is that? We can describe it in our sort of folk semantic or pragmatic folk terminology, but actually, what's underlying that? That's what I want to know. If you look at people who discuss presupposition, and I'm very broad and somewhat, probably not very totally, probably somewhat inaccurate overview here, but I'm just going to produce it anyway. So Grice talks about implicatures, for example, conventional implicatures, but he doesn't really explain this said-unsaid distinction. Stalnaker, interesting case, brings in the idea of pragmatic presupposition and sort of links it to the idea that it's, you know, what's pragmatically presupposed is taken to be part of the background of common knowledge of the discourse participants. But my question is, that's still not explaining presupposition, because I want to know what kind of speech act is the speaker producing and communicating the content that the attitudes are background. You know, for example, the speaker is not asserting that this is background content, background knowledge. They're not asserting that. They're, as it were, presupposing it. But what is this presupposing? I don't think Stalnaker answers that. Bach and Potts, I won't go through these quickly, or sorry, in any detail. Again, I think they never really sort of explicate this distinction between the said and the unsaid, or the said and the presupposed. So Potts has a very sort of detailed framework about conventional implicature, and it has a distinction between the at issue and not at issue content. But in the end, what is that distinction? What underlies it? What, as it were, structures in the speech acts ground that distinction? That's the mystery for me. Okay, so quick overview of what I think is the case. The power of slurs, pejoratives, etc., is somehow bound up with presupposition, the unsaid communication of, and I think it's to do with attitude. Okay, that's maybe debatable, but that's what I'm going to accept from now on. And there's no good received understanding of what the said, unsaid, or presupposed content distinction is. I've looked for it in standard semantic frameworks, which assume the sense-force distinction. That's fairly central to the standard sort of conceptualization of meaning. And I don't yet know of anything that's very satisfactory. And mere updating of conversational score pragmatics does not help in itself. It may do lots of interesting work, but it won't fully illuminate slurs and oppressive language until we really bring in the notion of what presupposition is, as opposed to saying. So we need to understand a said, unsaid, but communicated content distinction. But how? So it turns out this is just the thing that I've been trying to think about for quite a while. Written a few papers on it. But so here, what I'm going to try and do is just sort of sketch out the bare bones of the ideas. And I'm going to do this in hopefully about 18 minutes or maybe 19. If we're really unlucky, 20 minutes. And it involves this thing called global expressivism. And you might think, well, what the hell's that? Basically, it's generalizing ethical expressivism across the board. So I'm hoping people know what ethical expressivism is, the idea that moral claims involve somehow expression of attitude. And I want to generalize that, not with the idea that all speech acts and illocutionary acts, etc., express attitudes or motivations, but that they all, we should understand them all in terms of expression of mental states that, like attitudes, are not cognitive and they're not open to truth or falsity assessment. The truth and falsity assessment and the sort of cognitiveness, call it propositional content, that comes later. That comes at the level of speech acts involved in expression, where people are producing speech acts and processing speech acts. It's at that level that we can understand, as it were, content. But what we're expressing is pre-cognitive. That's the core idea. And it involves this idea of, I like to call it the intersubjective dimension, where you find agents, and here are my chimps, producing gestures and speech acts, let's say, and processing them. So it's in that interaction of production and processing that we'll understand, as it were, hopefully, the nature of presupposition. Okay, so global expressivism, GE, here it is. So I'm going to quickly go through the ideas. GE can explain this distinction between the said content and non-said content. Why? Because it's going to be the mode of expression that explains this distinction. There are different modes of expression, and that's of expressing mental states, and that's how we understand the said, non-said distinction. So GE is a form of metasemantics. It's not semantics. It's not going to tell you it's not going to give you a compositional theory of the meaning of sentences. Rather, it's expressivist about meaning. It'll tell you an expressivist story about what goes on when people make meaning claims. Okay, now I want to go on to sort of just get this up and running. All illocutionary acts involve the production of sentences expressing mental states, I call them pi states, which come in a network in the sort of, call it the mind functional system of the speaker. And these are pre-truth act, pre-cognitive. So all speech acts involve expressing such these states, which come in networks. But assertions involve acts whose purpose is to what I call defensively express speakers' pi states. All other illocutionary acts involve the production of sentences merely expressing speaker pi states. So here's the basic distinction. This is going to underpin the said, non-said distinction. The assertions, the domain of the said, not quite, but that'll do, is a crude characterization. This involves this idea of defensively expressing pi states, and all the other illocutionary acts like giving orders or conventional implicatures involve merely expressing pi states. And what's this defending idea? Well, roughly, not very totally accurately, it's this: the speech act of assertion is the act whose purpose is to manifest a dialectical stance in relation to a mental state pi. And that is more or less assertions in a sort of shades of Brandom and Alston, etc. Vein. It's when you're more or less manifesting your readiness to give reasons for a mental state. That's the purpose of the speech act. So it's speech acts of defensive expression of pi states that possess at-issue content status, so, and truth aptness. So this at-issueness, which seems to be part of the distinction between the said and the unsaid, is in this idea that in assertion, we are displaying ourselves as disposed to provide reasons for states, and that's the purpose of the act. It's specific acts of non-defensive expression of pi states that are the ones that we call not saying or presuppositional. That's the core idea. Now, I'm going to quickly just illustrate this idea. In fact, I don't think I'll just go through this slide because it might take us too long, but so I'm going to wildly skip over that. But I want to say that the slurs more or less involve a mixture of a defensive expression of mental states along with a non-defensive expression of attitude. And that's why they have a presuppositional stance in relation to attitudes. Okay, so quickly, I'm going to go through these pictures. So the core idea of assertion is that speakers are defensively expressing pi states. That's the sort of the underlying engine of assertion. That's what's going on. The purpose of the act is to display themselves as ready to give reasons. That's at the phenomenal folk level. That's sort of the machinery at the low level won't talk about reasons, but that doesn't matter for the purposes here. So we've got a speaker producing, let's say, a causal statement. This caused the break. And they defensively express a pi state linked to whatever causal statements are linked to in the end, but agent manipulation is the input into the mental states that you have when you make causal claims, because we learn about causation by manipulating things. And then here's an audience H on the right who is processing the speech act. They can't look inside the mind, as it were, of you, the speaker. Rather, they have largely automatic language processing systems that are going to, as it were, like mirror neuron processors, kind of produce, activate states in themselves, which are the kinds of states that would underpin their causal statement production. And then they're going to be oriented towards a defensive, if they agree, a defensive expression of the relevant pi state. Here's the thought. The speaker is calling forth, in effect, by engaging in assertion with this defensive expression. The speaker is calling forth dialectical preparedness. He is acknowledging H as an agent open to persuasion. Habermasian communicative democratic ideas come in at this point. So you is inviting rejection and revision. So it's built into the speech act structure of assertion and conversational exchange that is going on in effect. That's why the content is at issue. Now, very quickly, I now want to, so that's the basic idea for assertion. I now want to sort of zap through or bring in attitude. So there's a whole bunch of speech acts that express attitude. And it's useful to distinguish between reporting an attitude, defending an attitude, and presupposition of an attitude. All involve attitudes, but they're doing completely different things. And this doing of completely different things is the basis for why we distinguish, in the end, between, as it were, mere reports of disliking people, evaluative judgments about people, as opposed to the slurs where we covertly presuppose attitudes. So I just want to go through these now. So in terms of this framework with the pictures and so forth. So you got someone here saying, I dislike Steve, and then someone saying true. So this is a report about a subjective state. What are they doing? Well, they are defensively expressing a pi state, which is linked to monitoring their own or others' mental states. And in this case, the monitoring concerns a disliking state. And they're defensively expressing that. And then the agent, as it were, processes all that, etc., and activates a potential program for defensive expressing of a pi state linked to monitoring their own or others' behaviors. In this case, it's a statement, a non-evaluative statement about a psychological state. The speaker is called, and it's just like any other assertion, the speaker is calling for dialectical preparedness. You is acknowledging H as an agent, open to persuasion, etc. The content is at issue. What about what goes on when an evaluative judgment happens? So I'm an expressivist, so here we go. Steve is a bad dude. Okay, this is not a report about a subjective state. It's rather defensively expressing an attitude, in effect, a motivational state. And the audience says true, because they're willing to process that utterance, in which they activate a potential program for defensively expressing an attitude or a pi state. And as it were, that may become manifest in them, and they say true, where true is more or less just, again, the word we use to defensively express the relevant pi state. So in this case, the speaker is calling for dialectical preparedness, you is acknowledging H as an agent open to persuasion, etc., etc. The content is at issue. Okay. What about non-defense? So that's defensive expression of an attitude, but there is non-defensive expression of an attitude. We can find this in exercitives. So here's roughly the idea. So employees will only serve whites, says you. So this is a non-defensive expression of a pro-attitude delta to some action. The audience says yes, processes that, takes on the pro-attitude delta to action A. They take it on. But in this case, well, sorry, first question, why do they take that on? Well, the answer is there's an authority structure which more or less follows a kind of regularity that operates in a certain context, which is that if U expresses delta, then H takes on delta, based in H's fear or ideological programming, fear of losing their job, whatever it is. But note that in this case, U's utterance, the boss's utterance, involves no invitation to H to develop a dialectical stance in relation to the attitude. It's just, they may develop that later, but built into the speech act structure, it's just, as it were, not part of it. So it's very unlike assertion. So in this case, what's presupposed is the boss's power, the authority structure. The speaker, the boss, takes for granted the authority structure, maybe by separate threats or sweeteners, but the boss could assert you ought to or must do what I desire you to do. Then they would be doing something else. They would be defensively expressing a positive attitude to the authority structure. That would be an assertion about, as it were, authority. And the boss says, could also say, we ought to only serve whites, and that would be a defensive rather than a mere expression of attitude, which would be the output of the authority structure. The exercitive is not truth act. It's not said content because it doesn't involve defensive expression of an attitude. It involves mere expression of an attitude, and it's not calling forth, as it were, dialectical engagement from an audience. Okay, slurs. And this is a non-defensive expression, expressive illocutionary acts. So someone says, you, P is a Z, where the Z is a flirt term, slur term, they may be defensively expressing something which to do with the said content of the utterance, what underpin or underwrites that. But what they're doing, which characterizes it as a slur, is that they are also non-defensively expressing an attitude linked to negative affect. And the audience processes all that and just confirms that they have the attitude, let's say, or not. Now, in this case, the speaker is not calling forth dialectical preparedness about the attitude, not inviting dissent. There's no authority structure, unlike the exercitive. The attitude, this is just what presupposing the attitude is. So in other words, it's just non-defensively expressing the attitude where there is no, as it were, authority structure, as there is in the case of the exercitive. So here's the basic contrast between exercitives and conventional implicature presupposition. So in the first case, you is not calling forth from H a dialectical stance in relation to the attitude, but just the attitude, and the attitude is to be acquired by the authority structure. Whereas in conventional implicature presupposition, non-defensively expressing an attitude, you is not calling H to form a dialectical stance in relation to the attitude, but just sort of have the attitude. No authority structure is present, that's the difference. It's not being dialectically raised, right? This idea of in non-defensive expression, it's this idea that something is not being dialectically raised to the level of giving reasons or offering reasons, etc. That is the being taken for granted, being not at issue. And that's kind of my explanation of the Stalnackerian intuition. Okay, so that's the basic sort of framework for thinking about this. You think about sort of agents interacting with each other. And there's this basic, call it distinction between defensive expression versus non-defensive expression. And that's where you get the said, not non-said distinction. Now you might think, well, why does this involve somehow denying the sense-force distinction? Well, it is in the sense that you can't separate speech act structure from content. There's just no way of dividing it in the way that you usually do on the standard conceptions in which you have a sort of proposition on one side and a kind of illocutionary force on the other. I mean, that's the basic reason. Okay, so why should slurs be tied up with non-defensive expression rather than defensive? Why implicated rather than said content? Well, here's my sort of maybe slightly naive sociological theory, in part. In slave societies, the slavers don't defend their attitudes about their slaves, they presuppose them. To defend attitudes renders them as open to contention. Speech acts whose purpose is to manifest the capacity to give reasons for attitudes are not instrumental to, indeed they are detrimental to the aims of the slave owners, that being their aim, power over others. Slave owners would only defensively express the attitudes which they commonly express day to day with their slaves, like by saying they are not worthy of respect, in justifying their institutions to potential non-slave owner critics. Would never do that in relation to slaves. So offense, or the awfulness of slur language, I just want to sort of look at two aspects of it. So a slur, that is the slur targeted audience H, and the non-slur targeted non-prejudiced audience H, both can suffer, as it were, offense, though. Oh, yeah. So you says, the utterer says, you are Zs, or you Zs leave, etc., with the slur term. They're not calling upon H to have dialectical stance in relation to the expressed attitude, just calling on them to note that they have it or acquire it without setting themselves up to defend it or dissent from it. The presumption H has the attitude, their dissent is preempted. That's the silencing, that's the power of presupposition in this context. Non-slur targeted people are going to also, but lesser extent, obviously feel offense because again, if someone uses a slur term in my presence, there, as it were, because it's a non-defensive expression of an attitude, I kind of brought in as complicit with that because it's built into the structure of the speech act that I just, as it were, acknowledge I have it. And so that's the idea of power. Power is purely to do with historical, different strengths of slurs, purely to do with historical facts about the use of terms. Now, you may be worried about truth aptness. This is my last point, truth aptness and slur terms. The slur content, as it were, is not truth apt content. It's not making any contribution to the said content. And I think therein lies its power, the power of the unsaid. If theorists want to bring the slur content into the truth conditional content, I think that misses the covert power. You may be worried that it's only part of conventional implicature, that, for example, there is some slur content. What about when it fails? I mean, it seems we're going to have to say that slur claims are true, but infelicitous if we don't agree with the slurring orientation. And that's right, but it would be like saying it's true that even Beyonce is famous. That's true, but highly infelicitous. And it's even infelicitous to assert it, because for conversational implicature reasons, which I can go into, but I won't right now. And of course, we're going to tell some story about embedding and negation and attitude reports, but I think we can do that more or less within a more sophisticated framework of global expressivism. So to conclude, final thing. So I'm hoping this was something useful in this, at least to get a sketch of a framework in which we can understand the said, non-said distinction, and at least make some sort of a case that slurs, etc., involve the covertness of the unsaid, or at least used in a certain way. And my claims are these: by building in speech act structure into content, breaking down the false content distinction, we can explain said, the non-said distinction. And I think this framework, GE being globally expressivist, does not quite sit well with doing explanations of language activity in terms of normative statuses and scorekeeping frameworks. At least there's a certain tension between that sort of orientation. Don't quite get it, but I think in the end, it's the following. What's important for the expressivist is not so much the norms, but the recognition of the norms. So that's where the explanatory power is. And recognition of norms, not saying there are no norms, I'm just saying that the global expressivist framework would, as it were, tell you what's going on when people say, oh, that's wrong, that's right, that's permissible, etc. This would all involve defensive or non-defensive expression of attitudes. And that's kind of where the action is from the sort of basic framework. But that's sort of a bit speculative. I finished at that point.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting talk. And so the floor is open for discussion. And if you have a question, just type Q into the chat. And if you're a junior.
Hi, thanks for that talk. There's a lot of interesting overlap between the work we're doing and yours. I'm wondering about the history, and so just to indicate, we're going to be modifying the notion of presupposition so it relates to practices. So the history and practice of a slur term. So for you, the history and practice affects the strength of the slur, but it doesn't seem to affect the communicated content or the communicative effect. It only seemed to come in as far as the strength is concerned. So how do you think about the history and practice invoked by a slur term, as in Eric Swanson's terms, the ideology it cues?
Okay, I suppose I think the history is powerful only insofar as it's still kind of partially being lived. And so when I said history, I didn't mean, you know, if we'd all, as it were, gotten over the history, we might be happy with less exercised by the slur term. So I think it's because there are still ongoing historical consequences that we live, that's why some slur terms are very powerful, and that's why their sting is all the more sort of cogent or powerful. You made a distinction there maybe between the sort of the effect.
So it seems like you're just talking about the history and practices and historical practices associated with the term as bearing on its power.
Yeah.
But I want you to say more about how you understand that power.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if I've got a clear idea about that. I mean, my basic position is a word like in Australia, I'm from Australia, we would call English people POMs, right? There's very little, it's a very mild slur term. It's not even almost comical. And why is that? Well, and I think it's got the same structure in the word POM as in, whatever, the N word. But why the difference? I'd say they're linguistically identical in terms of overall structure. It's just that maybe the attitude involved may be, for example, stronger in one case than in the other. So as well, if you think of a structure and then you've got a little thing down here, sort of click attitude, okay, there's going to be some clearly difference in terms of attitude. But that attitude, as it were, really only functions in the context of some history that also is ongoing. And right. That's essentially it.
I was just concerned. I mean, I agree with all that. I just think that more or less power is not the only relevant effect of history and embedded practice. The power is due to the message that the practice brings with it. And that should be part of what's good, the story as well. You seem to me to have the resources to say that.
That may be true. So that would be good from my point of view. I may be a bit unsophisticated about thinking about the sort of the broader embedding because I haven't thought about it that much. So, but my main sort of concern is to get this sort of structure in there, like speech act, way of understanding speech acts, in order, you think, this might work in a way that, has more, you could hang more things on it in order to tell these, as what you're suggesting, complex stories about strength and etc., involving history or involving, as the final thing you said,
the message.
The message, yeah. So I'd be interested to hear more about message. So if I listen to your talk, I could hear about that. Yeah.
Overlap.
Yeah. So we should move on to the next question by Manfred Grifka.
Oh, hello. So very interesting talk. So I've one suggestion, and I like to hear what you think about that. So you with the normal idea about update of a common ground, one has sort of two options. So either the common ground is restricted by new information, or there is a imposed restriction on the input common ground, which is then presupposed. But I mentioned in my talk this idea by Anna Sabolsky, who assumed that there is a performative update of the common ground, which effectively means something like the speaker changes the world, and this is not negotiable in some sense. And she uses this for promises. I use this for this commitment to the truth of a proposition, for assertions. I'm thinking about that this is the place where exclamatives like "what a nice sunset" or so should be expressed as well. And I think that everything that you said fits actually nicely in my mind, that this could be the place where the information of slurs would fit as well. So this is not negotiable. It's just there. When a person uses this, then the information that the person has a certain attitude towards a certain group of people or so is just there. It's stated, and then automatically it's out in the world. It cannot be retracted, and so on. Now, one can think about different reactions to the nature of reactions to the proposed content in an assertion. So I can agree or disagree with the information that is expressed in these performative updates. I can only, as the addressee, consent or express a similar feeling, or can express that I don't feel like that. So I was wondering whether you could see that this step of a performative update could be something attractive.
It could be. I didn't. You mean a performative update is where you you actually produce a performative, or? Yeah.
So essentially, with a performative update, the word itself is changed. It's not just conveying of information, but the word is changed. That after that, the speaker has declared some attitude towards something.
Right.
It is not something to be negotiated. So as I said, with a regular assertion, I think there is a performative part that the speaker expresses responsibility for the truth of a proposition, and then everything else can be negotiated. But the expression for the truth of a proposition is not part of the negotiating anymore. In some sense, it's just there. The world has changed as insofar after this expression of responsibility, the speaker is responsible for the truth of this proposition.
Yeah, look, my position is fairly basic. I'm inclined to the view that the updating model, it's interesting, but it won't do the work it's meant to do, my claim, until we get let's say, a more or a different kind of view about speech acts that's going to explain, call it the said and the unsaid, the presupposed, etc. So, and then updating will be seen as it were, taking on speech act structures in let's say in an audience. They update, not as it were by assigning truth to propositions, let's say, or to restricting sets of possible worlds or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, they're taking on, as it were, a more sophisticated sort of creature that has these dimensions to it, which I think come out more clearly, or at least I think you can get a theory of presupposition versus saying, let's say, using this framework of the expressivist framework. And that's sort of the basic kind of point. What you add to that in terms of more nuanced accounts of updating, etc., is sort of more sort of added benefits. I mean, if that can do some work to let's say cater for your more subtle versions of updating, maybe involving certain kind of performatives or certain different kinds of reactions, that's all good from my point of view. And I would hope it would fit in with that. But my point is fairly basic, that per se, updating in the way that it's usually conceived, which I would say in a sort of an assumption of it sort of goes with truth conditional semantics. People treat propositions and updating in relations to propositions, that is truth apt entities, said contents, as sort of primary. And I think that's a mistake. Actually, what's more fundamental is the sort of, we're more open that there are just different modes of expression, and these are significant, and we get different, as it were, evaluative reactions, etc., accordingly. So that's where I am. So I'm up for adding more sophistication to it. And if it fits in, that will be good. If there's a conflict, then I suppose that's a problem to be resolved. Yeah. Am I answering your question, Matthew?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
I hope.
Yeah, thank you. So let's move on to the next question by Gillian Russell.
Hi, Steve. I enjoyed the talk. I was wondering if your framework had anything to say about the kind of leaky quotes phenomenon, where people often don't just avoid using slurs, but also avoid quotation mark names for them. So we have workarounds like the N word instead of putting it in quotation marks.
Yeah.
I kind of wondered if there was going to be sort of a solution to that puzzle. And then if there might be other phenomena other than slurs that would sort of have the same features.
I'm not totally familiar with the puzzle. So again, I'm not deeply steeped in the literature on slurs. Sorry about that. However, if you, I mean, there's this thing about using as opposed to mentioning. And I don't think there's much, as it were, of a difference between use and mention for at least most people who are outside of analytic philosophy. So if I go quote using a slur term, that still, as it were, can be troubling or offensive for my audience, just as much if I had used it. So putting quotes, little scare quotes like that, doesn't quite help. Why is that, is the question. I don't know, I'm not quite sure what the puzzle is that you're referring to. But
yeah, I mean, that surprised me because, I mean, people don't seem to have that much difficulty telling the difference between like putting something in quote marks and not. So if I tell you that he said you were crazy, right?
No, good.
How would it take me to have said that you're crazy?
No, cool. No, absolutely. So quotes can be like a proxy speech act. So I used to think of quote scare quotes as like, well, it's not me speaking now. So there's like a kind of an implicature of some kind in which I'm more or less, as it were, momentarily speaking for someone else. It's not actually what I would use. So I grant you that if that's what you're referring to, absolutely, we can tell that difference. We accept the idea that, yes, this isn't I'm not really expressing my views when I use the term.
Yeah, so the puzzle is going to be that the N word is very different from, say, just crazy or like some other thing might not want to be called, but.
Yeah, I agree. So I think it's like using, maybe this is not a very good parallel, but if you use words for bodily functions and so forth, even if you put quotes around them, people still don't want you to use them, right? You can't, and that's because when you as an audience, here's my pet theory, I don't know how sophisticated it is, but when you as an audience process that term, I have to, as it were, you have, at least at some level, subpersonal, subdoxastic level, it's not going to be pleasant, as it were, for you, whether it's done with Mickey Mouse quotes or not. And so in other words, I suppose it's a story of association at some point that's preventing one from getting away with doing that. It won't remove, in other words, cleanse it of its unpleasant connotations. That doesn't sound particularly sophisticated answer, but that's kind of the one I'd want to give. But does that, do you think?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether this would have a solution to that puzzle.
Oh, I don't think per se it does, is the short answer. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for more questions. So. Or remarks.
Ooh, how much time do we have?
9 minutes left from the discussion period. So, yeah, so Jason has another question.
I'm just responding to Jillian on your behalf.
Yeah.
So I think you do have, I think if you just, if you decouple you only have the past and the practice and the history there to explain strength. But there's a link, but you clearly recognize in your remarks a link between the term, the slur term, and its embeddedness, its social embeddedness in history and practice. If you quote, there's still the social embeddedness link between the term and its practice. The quote doesn't eliminate the link between the N-word and its history. Quotation isn't that magical.
Yeah.
So you do have a response to Jillian.
Oh, right.
If you just don't think of the relationship between, I mean, you recognize that slurs are in some sense conventionally connected to a history and a practice. You can't eliminate that conventional connection by quotation.
Yeah.
It still has that. It still evokes it.
Good. Yeah. Thank you. I think so. I suppose that answer is good, seems right to me. I suppose it's not specifically to do with my framework, I suppose. So you might tell that kind of story in terms of other frameworks.
Yeah, but
so I think that I'm a bit of I think of language processing, et cetera, it's not like Humpty Dumpty. We're not in control of it. It's largely an automatic process of, when I comprehend stuff, it just happens. I've got no agency to stop it. So doing whatever you like isn't going to prevent that history coming up or the embedded practices currently being around in terms of what's going to go on in my own mind, as it were, insofar as I'm alive to it, which I will be or should be usually. And so that's why you're not Humpty Dumpty. You can't just remove it.
You're at least presenting the idea. You're at least making salient that history and practice. You're endorsing it. And so that can explain a little bit what's going on.
Right.
I don't know what Jillian thinks. Jillian?
So I can see how there's something in the vicinity of this that could do it. But it doesn't seem enough to say that, look, just because you put it in quotation marks doesn't erase the history and social practice, because just referring to it as the N-word doesn't erase the history and social practice either. So there's this question about why is it okay to use that and not okay to use it in. Okay, so, but it could be something. I mean, Steve said association. Eric Swanson has that stuff about like triggering the ideology and stuff. Like it could be that the quotation word is so close to the word itself that triggers the same ideology or it triggers the same associations.
Yeah, I think you probably process the word first before the quotation. And by the time you process the word, it's already happened. Then you go, oh, but this is quotes. And it's like, at least the N-word's a bit better. Sorry, using the N-word is slightly better because you're at some sort of cognitive distance from it, as it were, at least in terms of the processing that's going to be going on, maybe.
But it will might change over time.
But it might change over time, exactly.
Which I think we've already experienced with the N-word itself.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's one more question by Michaela.
Just if there are no others, I just, I'm totally on board with the kind of this association invoking and everything that goes with that. Yeah, precisely, kind of attached to the word, and that's, you get that conventionality. I want to press you a little bit more on the updating of the scoreboard and common ground on the other hand. So you think that, okay, that's not doing much of the work. But if you have the right ingredients, and the way I'm sort of kind of bringing in power and the kind of history via this sort of roles, precisely when you add that kind of, you know, that machinery onto your on the score, and that keeps updating. And you know, yeah, the story is more sophisticated in terms of like Mary Kay McGowan's views. Like you have this, you know, you have a score change, and in parallel to that, you have this constant updating. You sort of have parallel acts that enact terms and sort of make new things permissible. So if somebody is using a slur, then the permissibility have changed within the conversational score, as it were, and that's one way of kind of linking what we do with language with the social structure in the background. You sort of bringing in, reenacting, making it kind of, you just give it the force that it's, and that's one way of kind of linking the two. And precisely the continuous updating of the conversations, which will then update the social norms and so on. It's kind of this feedback loop that keeps everything alive. What we do with language is precisely making those social structure alive, and then we can, you know, piggyback on them in future and so on.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Good. Well, fine. I suppose I was saying in crudest terms, the update model may be necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah, you need more.
I think we need to add this. No, not just as it were context and so, but in terms of the speech acts, the structure of speech acts, the presuppositional versus non, the non-said, the said, etc. So I wanted to bring that in, and then here would be my way of reconciling, as it were, the two. Would be, yeah, sure. Just add those ingredients in terms of the structure of speech acts. And, you know, of course, I like global expressivism, be a global expressivist, but then we can all add the stuff about roles and you know, in the broader context, etc. Why not? We could do that as well. So it's not necessarily in conflict. I suppose I was just suggesting, put it simply, necessary, probably necessary, all the update stuff, etc., but not sufficient insofar as you need to more, let's say, a better view about speech act structure, or get a better concept of the content of what gets updated. And this is going to track things like, oh, is it a non-defensive expressive or expressive defensive, non-defensive expressive or a defensive expressive, etc.
Yeah, and that in a way, that's why in a way the view from that side isn't necessarily in conflict with your picture, because
no.
Conversational exercitives are kind of this sort of presuppositional or kind of granted insofar as sort of bringing in social.
Yeah, no, it could be dovetailed together, married. I suppose I've just got this slight phobia about norms. Sorry, I believe that there are norms. But I don't think normative statuses in themselves are explanatory. It's only recognition that is. It's doing the engine, you know, where I recognize that something's permissible, or I agree that it's permissible, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, being card-carrying global expressivist, that means that's caught up with motivation and expressing, even in my private judgments, defensive expression of attitudes or non-defensive expression of attitudes. And I slightly don't like this sort of objective picture of a view from nowhere of the score of the conversation. I think we're all situated, and we should tell the story of situated agents, sort of, as we're reacting to information in a conversation, because conversations are often out of control, and you know, who knows what's going on in them, sort of thing. But the agent is, to some extent, you can track the agents, I suppose. So I'm slightly a bit skeptical about the idea of an objective God's eye view of the score of conversation with its normative statuses. Fine, okay, so that could probably all be, brought in. Yeah, so I don't see any principal conflict or incompatibility. Yeah.
If I may,
So, Michaela, I think we have to
yeah.
stop with the discussion. So I thank you all for the lively discussion, interesting talk. And we have a short break of 9